Welcome to NTD Newsroom. I'm Jan.9. The Treasury Department promising to go after alleged welfare fraud in Minnesota. Secretary Scott Bessent says some of the funds may have already been transferred to Africa. The Department of Justice is looking into a voter registration vouching system in Minnesota. The Department of Homeland Security and Citizenship and Immigration Services are also examining thousands of refugee claims. U.S. forces seize another oil tanker in the Caribbean. The seizure comes as the Trump administration works to control Venezuelan oil exports. President Trump with three major announcements on Venezuela. This coming as top oil executives are about to meet President Trump and administration officials at the White House. The DHS says the two people shot by a Border Patrol officer in Portland are associated with the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua. According to DHS, both suspects entered the U.S. illegally under the Biden administration. U.S. payrolls increased less than expected in December. The economy added 50,000 new jobs last month. We have analysis on that.
This is NTD Newsroom, live from our global headquarters in New York City.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent promising to crack down on welfare fraud in Minnesota. In a press conference in Minneapolis today, Bessent said the Treasury Department is focusing on funds that may have been transferred overseas.
At Treasury, we are thoroughly investigating the fraud, including funds sent to Somalia through money service businesses which provide financial services outside of a formal bank. These funds could have potentially been diverted to the terrorist organization Al-Shabaab. We have traced where the money went and are examining it.
The Treasury Secretary said his department is investigating financial institutions to make sure they are complying with anti-money laundering laws. His agency has followed the money and identified the money service businesses that have made transferred taxpayer funds overseas. Bessent said the Minnesota protocols will serve as a launching pad for investigations into other states.
We are going to leave no stone unturned, whether it was fraudulent real estate, whether it is money that has been wired overseas. We will be tracking it to the Middle East and East Africa. This is why Treasury is involved. This is what we do. We track, we follow the money, and we intend to follow it as much as we can, prosecute the individuals no matter where they are, whether they are in the Minnesota government or they are sitting in East Africa. We will find them.
The Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, known as FinCEN, is working with the IRS on this matter. The Treasury is providing training to Minnesota law enforcement on how to utilize financial data. The IRS will also launch a task force to investigate any fraud and abuse involving pandemic-era tax incentives and misuse of 501c3 tax-exempt status. The Treasury Secretary said the Trump administration is committed to putting an end to welfare fraud. The Trump administration is being sued by 5 Democrat-led states. A coalition comprised of California, Colorado, Illinois, Minnesota, and New York is asking a court to halt a funding freeze from the White House. Officials in the 5 states say the move is unconstitutional and violates law and regulations linked to federal aid programs. The lawsuit is being led by New York Attorney General Letitia James, who says the administration has not given, quote, any legitimate justification for stopping the funds. The Trump administration has cited concerns about fraud in the programs designed to help low-income families and their children. The Department of Justice is looking into a voter registration vouching system in Minnesota. Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights Harmeet Dillon says the department is investigating an apparent conflict with federal law.
What you have in Minnesota, which, as we know, is a fraud and corruption-riddled state now, is a system where any one registered voter can vouch for 8 people and say that I know that Bob and Jose and Jimmy and whoever and my neighbors, they all live in my neighborhood and they're residents of this district, so you should register them. But even worse, a single person who's a worker at a residential facility, like a home, like care for elderly or disabled, they can register the entire facility.
Meanwhile, the Department of Homeland Security and Citizenship and Immigration Services are examining thousands of refugee claims in Minnesota. Dubbed Operation Paris, the investigation will focus on more than 5,000 refugees who have not yet been given lawful permanent resident status. A previous investigation dubbed Operation Twin Shield recently uncovered widespread immigration fraud in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. A newly established vetting center will conduct background checks, interviews, and reviews of refugee claims. Tensions in Minneapolis remain high following the ICE shooting on Wednesday. Protests are now also spreading into the nation's capital. A federal agent shot and killed a woman after she drove her car into him. The Trump administration says she weaponized her vehicle to attack officers, calling it an act of domestic terrorism. According to new numbers from Homeland Security, vehicular attacks on ICE agents are up by over 3,000%. The numbers compare the Trump administration's 2025 term to President Biden's 2024 term. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey is calling on the federal government to let state authorities participate in the investigation of the shooting. House Speaker Mike Johnson is weighing in as well, saying a full investigation will take place.
In Minneapolis, when a tragedy strikes, there's one word that summarizes what is most important, and that word is integrity. This is not the time to bend the rules. This is a time to follow the law. This is not a time to hide from the facts. This is a time to embrace them, making sure that we're pushing for transparency every step of the way.
We all understand there has to be a full investigation. That's the appropriate thing. That will happen. But I think you'll verify that on the video. It appears to us that the officer involved was operating in self-defense. He made a snap judgment, as they do. He had been drugged behind a vehicle already, we now know, this particular officer, and he felt that his life and the life of his fellow officers and potentially bystanders was in danger. And so we'll have to see.
Hundreds of people marched through the streets of Minneapolis last night near the site of the shooting. Attacks on ICE agents have already been increasing in recent months. Hostility is now growing even further after Wednesday's incident. Protesters also marched to the White House last night. Similar to the situation in Minnesota, protesters in Washington are calling on ICE agents to leave the city. Governor Tim Walz is authorizing the Minnesota National Guard to support local law enforcement. According to a statement yesterday, the troops will be staged and ready out of an abundance of caution and in coordination with local officials. The statement says the goal is to help maintain peace, ensure public safety, and allow for peaceful demonstrations. Meanwhile, the Department of Homeland Security says the two people shot by a Border Patrol officer in Portland are associated with the Venezuelan gang Trendy Argua. DHS spokeswoman Tricia McLaughlin told Fox News that the shooting was justified.
Our law enforcement officers pulled them over as they were approaching the vehicle. When the subjects realized who our law enforcement were, they pulled forward, attempting to hit our law enforcement. And that's when our agent, he again followed his training and fired defensive shots.
According to DHS, both suspects entered the U.S. illegally under the Biden administration. Both were released into the country. DHS said the male suspect had been arrested for driving under the influence and unauthorized use of a vehicle. He had already been subject to a final order of removal. The department said the female suspect was part of a Trendy Argua prostitution ring. DHS added that she was involved in a prior shooting in Portland. The department said the two suspects are not married, despite earlier reports. Meanwhile, Oregon's Attorney General announced an investigation into the shooting. And after the altercation last night, the Portland Police Bureau says 6 people were arrested near an ICE facility. Those arrested range in age from 24 to 48. Most are from the greater Portland area. All 6 were booked on suspicion of second-degree disorderly conduct. Police say they asked protesters to move to the sidewalk and stop blocking traffic. That request was made around 9 p.m. local time. We now have access to new footage showing a different perspective of the Minnesota ICE shooting. It appears to show the federal agent being hit by Renee Nicole Good's car. Let's take a look.
That's fine, dude. I'm not mad at you. Show your face. I'm not mad at you. It's okay. We don't change our plates every morning, just so you know. It'll be the same plate when you come talk to us later. That's fine. U.S. citizen. You want to come at us? You want to come at us? I say go get yourself some lunch, big boy. Go ahead.
Out of the car. Get out of the car. Get out of the car.
Oh!
The video obtained by Alpha News appears to show the perspective of the ICE agent involved in the shooting. The news agency said this is a cell phone video filmed in the moments leading up to the shooting. Vice President J.D. Vance and White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt both shared the footage. They said this proves the ICE officer was acting in self-defense. Other videos of the shooting posted to social media showed the agent holding a cell phone in the moments leading up to the shooting. And according to a report by the New York Post, Good was involved with a local anti-ICE activist coalition known as ICE Watch. Local authorities are asking residents who witnessed the incident to submit video footage. And Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent putting a few things into motion, like investigating money services businesses in Minnesota and announcing an upcoming IRS fraud task force. The department is also targeting money laundering. To discuss Minnesota fraud, the ICE shooting in Portland, and the protests in Iran, joining us is Gerard Filitti, senior counsel at the Lawfare Project, political strategist and Middle East affairs analyst. Gerard, good afternoon. I just want to start off by asking this. What do you think is at the root of this problem, that there's this level of fraud in Minnesota?
Well, I think the level of this fraud is unprecedented, and one of the reasons why it's this large is it simply has not been examined. This is something that's happened within a more isolated community, using different communications methods, using different tactics to send money, to funnel money out of the state system. So this has not been so easy to catch. And as we've seen from a lot of investigative reporting, they actually do set up some sort of business. There actually is some sort of physical presence for some of these operations that your viewers are seeing on the screen right now. So that makes it more difficult for fraud to be detected, because it's not just a PO box, there's a physical presence and people who are there receiving the checks.
Vice President Vance yesterday announced the creation of a new assistant attorney general position, to help investigate billions of dollars in fraud affecting the federal government. How much of an impact do you think this will have?
I think it will have a huge impact. Up until this point, fraud has been treated as a one-off. We've had task forces over the years that have looked at different aspects of fraud and abuse. We've seen fraud and abuse come up in the context of Doge as well at the beginning of President Trump's second term. But now having an assistant attorney general dedicated to this shows that the government is committing resources to address this as a systemic problem. This is a whole of the government approach that will be more efficient going forward in detecting and prosecuting these cases so that we see less of it. So this is not just a one-off task force to address one problem. This is being set up as a way to address a systemic problem of fraud that's affecting many parts of the government.
Okay, Gerard, now about the protests. Just yesterday, 2 people were shot by an immigration agent in Portland. DHS says they are illegal aliens connected to Tren de Aragua. So can you tell us more about Tren de Aragua members and the kind of risks U.S. agents are working under to capture them?
Well, Tren de Aragua is identified and labeled as a terrorist group, as a narco-terrorist organization. So this is a level of federal designation that speaks to their dangerousness. This is not just a gang. This is not just drug dealers or thugs. This is organized crime that's directed by foreign interests. So the members of this organization, the members are really narco-terrorists who pose a significant danger to national security, to civilians, and to law enforcement. We're not talking about drug dealers. We're talking about people who have guns, people who are armed, and people who are here to do significant damage. So when we have these law enforcement encounters, unfortunately, these are not people who are just here illegally. These are people who are here committing crime.
So FBI Director Kash Patel said the Bureau is investigating anti-immigration enforcement protests and the review includes organizers, protesters, funding sources. He said those campaigns may be driving illicit activities. Do you see any patterns when it comes to the tactics that are being used by protest groups?
We're absolutely seeing patterns. We're seeing very aggressive protesters. What we're not seeing are peaceful demonstrations where people are marching to a public square to be heard. These are protesters who are actually physically encountering law enforcement officers, trying to block their cars, trying to prevent them physically from gaining access to buildings or to perform their law enforcement functions. And this is organized. This is not just in one occasion or one location. We have people who are designating themselves as observers or as leaders who are there to identify the law enforcement personnel and publish their location, to track how they're operating. This is highly sophisticated and not just something done by random people who are dissatisfied with a government policy. So this level of organization is funded and it's directed. And what the government is saying now is that it needs to find out who is organizing this to start cracking down so that we don't have these violent confrontations that lead to tragedy.
Okay, you said these protests largely are not peaceful. So when do protests become an impediment to law enforcement operations and endanger public safety?
They become an impediment the moment you go from peacefully saying what you want to grabbing police officers, throwing rocks, throwing firebombs, targeting officers with violence, getting in their way to prevent them from leaving or preventing them from entering something. That's no longer a peaceful First Amendment verbal protest. That's conduct. That becomes conduct that's illegal. So you're allowed in this country to say that you don't want police in your neighborhood or you don't want ICE in your neighborhood, but you cannot block their cars or try to push them away from buildings, because that becomes a crime. That's the conduct that becomes a crime. And unfortunately, what we're seeing and what we're seeing more often is that we're not just seeing peaceful protesters like you see on your screen, people holding signs, but we're seeing people engaged in physically confronting law enforcement. And that's dangerous. It leads to escalations where violence has occurred and people have lost their lives.
Now, Gerard, about the protests in Iran, what is the significance of these protests? Is what's happening now different?
These are perhaps the most significant protests we have seen in Iran in the last 46 years of the Ayatollah's regime that have the potential for actually bringing down the current government. Unlike previous protests, which were targeted by students or by people who are dissatisfied with a specific government policy, we see people now mobilizing on the streets from all walks of life: merchants, professors, teachers, students, pensioners. Everyone is gathering on the streets to protest the conditions that the government has resulted in Iranian economy, in Iranian people suffering under this regime. And what we're seeing now is not a demand for a structural change. We're seeing a demand targeting that the entire government go. So this is the most significant set of protests that we've seen in the last 46 years.
Okay, just finally, what do you make of President Trump's threat of involvement if the Iranian regime kills any protesters? And this is, of course, against the backdrop of what the administration just did in Venezuela.
I think it's a very powerful threat that's reverberating strongly within the Iranian government. I think that President Trump is looking to sustain and to uphold human rights values in Iran. So the message is to the Ayatollah regime, to the Islamist Republic, to not use violence against the people, the civilians, to keep the soldiers, their enforcement mechanism, their secret police on their base. I think President Trump is likely, if anything, to strike military targets if he sees tanks rolling to suppress the people. If he sees the military being used to target civilians, President Trump may order directed strikes against these military facilities, not boots on the ground, not involvement in Iran, but eliminating assets that the regime is using to oppress people. And that would be a very powerful incentive for the people of Iran to finally get their freedom.
Okay, Gerard, very insightful comments today. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Tensions ratchet up in Iran. Supreme Leader Anatoly Ali Khamenei accused President Trump of having hands stained with blood of Iranians. Iranian state television showed footage of people shouting, "Death to America." State media later repeatedly referred to demonstrators as terrorists. The harsh language could be setting the stage for a violent suppression like those followed other nationwide protests in recent years. NTD's Jason Perry has the Middle East update.
Protesters in Iran on Thursday gathered around an Iranian flag and then began tearing it up. Protests were held across Iran, including in the capital, after the country's exiled crown prince, Reza Pahlavi, called for mass demonstrations on Thursday and Friday. And he said based on their response, he'll announce the next call to action. However, internet and telephone lines in Iran were cut out immediately after the protests began. The U.S.-based human rights activist news agency said at least 41 people have been killed during the demonstrations, while more than 2,000 others have been detained. And President Trump has threatened U.S. intervention if Iran shoots peaceful protesters. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi on Thursday addressed the nationwide protests. An interpreter then translated his words into Arabic.
We are ready for any situation. We do not want war, but we are ready for it. We are also ready for negotiations, but negotiations that are based on mutual interests and respect.
Jason Perry, NTD News.
Allegations the Chinese Communist Party is backing leftist protests here in America. The issue is back in the spotlight as ICE agents, or rather anti-ICE protests and protests supporting Venezuela's ousted dictator Nicolas Maduro start up again. A House committee this week approved a subpoena for a pro-Beijing billionaire who is suspected of bankrolling the organized protests. NTD's Melina Weisskopf reports.
Anti-ICE protests starting up again in Minnesota, and protests opposing the capture of communist dictator Nicolas Maduro popped up in New York City.
We saw it in the protests that were pro-Maduro, supposedly, where everyone showed up with the exact same protest sign, paid for by individuals largely based out of China. There's a real concern here that we have a vivid fifth column approaching on U.S. shores that are trying to advance a pro-Beijing agenda.
The groups behind these protests, like the Party for Socialism and Liberation, are suspected to be a socialist network bankrolled by a China-based billionaire named Nelvil Roy Singham.
But when those things happen, and they're sensitive and they try to support, quite frankly, our enemies, and China is not a friend of the U.S., then my guess is there's probably some illegal activity.
Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna described Singham as the funding arm of the CCP.
He is definitely someone that is anti-American in ideology, and regardless of where you might stand, even on topics like Israel versus Palestine, is funding certain groups that actually sow discord in this country with no efforts to actually resolve the issues, only to get us to fight one another.
Congresswoman Luna has moved to subpoena Singham to testify before the House Oversight Committee, emphasizing that if Singham doesn't comply, lawmakers will hold him in contempt.
What we've uncovered is I feel like the tip of the iceberg still, and so there's a lot more work to be done, and then bring the swift arm of justice behind it.
The committee will probe the links between Singham and the CCP. When she made the motion to subpoena Singham on Wednesday, the top Democrat on the committee urged his side of the aisle to support it.
I understand these concerns. I'm going to recommend that we vote yes on the Luna motion.
The pro-Beijing billionaire has been under the microscope for several months. The Oversight Committee opened their investigation into Singham last summer, and former Senator Marco Rubio previously referred him to the DOJ. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
President Trump about to host the top 14 oil companies at the White House. They plan to discuss returning to Venezuela following the capture of former dictator Nicolas Maduro. We now go live to NTD's Washington correspondent at the North Lawn of the White House, Mari Otsu. Mari, good afternoon. What can we expect from this meeting?
Don, good afternoon. That's right. The meeting was closed to press earlier in the morning, but just a few minutes ago they opened it up, so we'll get live updates from that soon. And this morning, a White House spokeswoman, Taylor Rogers, told us that we can expect American oil companies coming to the White House to discuss investment opportunities that will restore Venezuelan oil infrastructure. She says that the American people, the Venezuelan people, and energy companies will all benefit from these investments. And this is coming as U.S. forces earlier this morning boarded an oil tanker in the Caribbean Sea. That tanker was called the Olena, and it is now the fifth oil tanker that U.S. forces have either boarded or seized in the past month. And President Trump, weighing in on this meeting on Truth Social, says that the U.S. has now canceled canceled the previously planned second wave of attacks on Venezuela, saying he thinks that they're no longer needed. But however, all ships will stay in place for safety and security purposes. He also says that at least $100 billion are expected to be invested in big oil. And here he is previewing the meeting last night. Take a look.
We'll be right here in the White House. We're going to meet with the biggest oil people in the world. They're all coming here. The top 14 companies are coming here. They're going to go in. They're going to rebuild the whole oil infrastructure. They're going to spend at least $100 billion. And it's an unbelievable oil that they have and an unbelievable quality of oil and amount of oil.
When they nationalized the oil industry in Venezuela, going back to the 1920s, American companies had invested billions.
We built it.
All of it.
And then it was taken away from us.
Stolen.
It was stolen from us. And it was taken away, years ago over a period of time, but it was taken away in the early 2000s, even beyond that, but the early 2000s. And I just took it back.
This coming as President Trump this week made 3 big announcements concerning Venezuela in the wake of the capture of former Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro. The first announcement is that Venezuela would turn over 30 to 50 million barrels of sanctioned oil to the U.S., and the U.S. will then sell that at market price for both the benefit of the American people and the Venezuelan people. And then Venezuela, with those profits, will buy only American-made products. And then the third announcement is that Venezuela has agreed to release all political prisoners. Here's Energy Secretary Chris Wright saying what he thinks it'll take to rebuild the oil infrastructure in Venezuela. Take a look.
Look, for 25 years, we've seen the collapse of the Venezuelan regime. Everything going the wrong direction, a totalitarian socialist dictatorship. And guess what? We've got wildly different leverage now. We've got a Venezuelan government that wants to work with the United States, that wants to try to end the corruption and snuff out all the problems in their country. Or at least they're going to work constructively with us, because that's the only way they get oil revenue. But I have been deluged with companies interested to go to Venezuela. So this is really going to be just President Trump changing the conditions so businesses want to go back in for business reasons. They want to go back. Thousands of Venezuelans in the United States and around the world work for these companies. They're thrilled at the prospect to be able to go back home to their country and help drive change there and help get the energy industry going again.
And President Trump today announcing that he'll be meeting with Colombia's Gustavo Petro in the first week of February at the White House. He also warns that cocaine and other drugs must be stopped from coming into the U.S. And last night, President Trump said that he'll be meeting with the Venezuelan opposition leader, Maria Machado, in the next week. Machado said this week that she wants to give President Trump her Nobel Peace Prize for liberating her country. Don, back to you.
All right, Mari, thank you. The Supreme Court will not issue a ruling today on a challenge to President Trump's authority to impose tariffs. The High Court heard arguments in November. Trump imposed tariffs by invoking the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The president says the tariffs are necessary to address what he has described as a national emergency regarding U.S. trade deficits. Trump has imposed tariffs on China, Canada, and Mexico, citing the trafficking of fentanyl and illicit drugs into the United States. Trump has also imposed reciprocal tariffs on goods imported from other nations that trade with the U.S. Businesses impacted by the tariffs and 12 states brought the challenges. The U.S. economy added about 50,000 jobs last month. That's the estimate released today by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's down from 64,000 jobs that were added in November. The number also falls short of the 55,000 new jobs economists were expecting. The report also reflects a job market that is stable enough to give investors hope the Federal Reserve will cut interest rates this year. The BLS also reported an unemployment rate of 4.4%, down from November's four-year high of 4.6%. The director of the National Economic Council, Kevin Hassett, commented on the new figures on Fox News this morning.
Look at the labor market, it's very strong. It's surprised on the upside 3 out of the last 4 months. This one was about an expectation. And if you look at the underlying fundamentals, the unemployment rate went down. And you know, they do 2-digit rounding. It was actually like down almost 2% if they weren't rounding. And the bottom line is the thing we care most about for the future of the labor market is what's happening to wage growth. Yep. And if you look at the wage growth for this year, manufacturing wages, for example, were up $3,000 per worker. And so that's the kind of thing that marks a healthy labor market. You know, under Obama and Biden, there was basically no real wage growth.
The new jobs report today shows the U.S. economy seeing modest gains in the number of jobs. Meanwhile, President Trump announced a purchase of $200 billion in mortgage bonds to lower loan rates. Joining us to discuss is Joseph Trevisani, economic and currency analyst at FX Street. Joseph, good afternoon. Hope you're doing well so far in the new year. So jobs increased by 50,000, and this was below forecasts. Is the labor market stalling?
I think the labor market is reasonably solid. By the way, good afternoon, Don. Nice to see you in the new year. I think it's reasonably solid. It's not producing a great number of jobs, as in the numbers out of the Labor Department. But do you remember what we have here? They have revamped their way of calculating jobs, and so it's a different ball game now without the input of what used to be called the birth-death model. So it looks to be still a pretty reasonably solid job market.
What do you think is contributing to perhaps constrained job creation? Because during the Biden administration, you remember this, we were often getting monthly numbers of over 100,000.
Right. And a lot of those numbers in the Biden administration were later revised away, which was the problem with using the birth-death model that the Labor Department uses or used to use to classify and to estimate jobs that are created in the month. So it's hard to say exactly what is behind you're not getting the type of 100,000, 150,000 jobs that you were getting. As I said, part of that is a revision of the way they're calculating jobs. Part of it, I think, is probably also uncertainty about where the economy is going to go.
What about tariffs? How do tariffs play into this equation? Is it having an impact that's leading to lower hiring?
Well, that's interesting. I don't think it really is yet, and I don't anticipate that it's going to. When the tariffs were first started, and as an economic policy back last year in April and May, there was a great deal of speculation in the economic community and the forecasting community that this would be a huge hit to jobs and it would be a huge boost to inflation. Neither has happened. I thought at the time, and I still do, that the threat to inflation, which could eventually turn into a threat to jobs, was overstated because manufacturers and retailers will absorb and did absorb much of the increases to maintain their market share. So that particular problem hasn't occurred. Will the tariffs achieve their stated goal of revitalizing U.S. manufacturing, which would, of course, mean more jobs, has yet to be seen.
So, Joseph, I don't think you would classify this as extraordinarily strong job growth. So if that is the case, I want to ask you, can the economy grow without such growth?
Yes, I think it can, because what you're looking at, remember, behind these job numbers that we've seen, and if you look at the last 3 job numbers, they're actually flat because the prior 3 months ago was down 105,000. So the last 3 jobs numbers are flat. But if you look behind that, you look at a GDP that in the last 3 quarters is growing. If you take the Atlanta Fed's GDP estimate for the 4th quarter of 5.1%, their latest one, at a 4.4% rate in the last 3 quarters. That's the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 4th quarters of last year. With that kind of GDP growth, it is very difficult not to expect a much stronger job market in this year. I would say 100, 150,000, 200, many more jobs once the economy gets sorted out as to what is actually happening and where the growth is occurring.
Okay, we'll keep a close watch on that, but I want to move on to President Trump announcing a purchase of $200 billion in mortgage bonds. And of course, the goal is to reduce mortgage rates, lower monthly payments, make it more affordable to buy a home. How much of a difference do you think that's going to make in actually lowering mortgage rates?
Well, it will. I mean, the 30-year mortgage, the 30-year average or the 30-year mortgage dropped 22 points today. That's a pretty substantial amount for a one-day move. It's now below 6%. I think mortgage rates, the two things that go into, of course, housing purchases are jobs, which are stable and steady, and interest rates, mortgage rates specifically. If you look at the numbers over the past 5 years, the number of home purchases, existing home sales, has dropped almost 40% from the fourth quarter of 2020. And the large portion of that is the rise in interest rates that attended the inflation that we saw throughout the middle and later part of the Biden administration. So I think, yes, two things are true here. One, the market now senses what the direction is. I don't think the Fed is going to intervene in the markets to the same degree that it did in COVID, where it bought like 500 billion and more, and over $1 trillion in total of MBS paper. I don't think that's going to happen, but it certainly is the direction markets are going. And if the Fed moves a little bit more on lowering the Fed funds rate, I think market rates and interest rates will follow.
Okay, so what are the core reasons that mortgage rates are higher now than before? And do you think that President Trump will have to, continually purchasing these bonds in order to keep the rates sustained at a lower rate?
Well, it's an interesting question. Will President Trump continue to berate the federal authorities and the Fed about what he wants for his policy? Yes, I think he probably will. That is Mr. Trump's way of doing business. I think the greatest impact on the decline in home sales, particularly existing home sales, has been the rise in interest rates. And they attended the inflation of the Biden administration when we went up to 9% in total for the CPI. So I think that is the greatest impact. On top of that, you have a falling off of about 20% in the number of new homes started. New homes tend to be the homes that first-time buyers buy, that they contract for in a mortgage. That is the most sensitive, I think, sector for interest rates. In other words, new home buyers who have, of course, less money, less established credit, need lower interest rates more than established buyers. So the more you get interest rates down, the more that particular sector of the market, of the housing market, I think, will expand. Once there are buyers online, then you get builders online, then you get new home starts. So I do think that interest rates going down, headed lower, both by the Fed's pressure and, if you want, by jawboning from President Trump, will impact and will improve the housing market.
Okay, just finally, two things here. One is, do you think if President Trump stops buying these bonds, that rates will go back up? And the second thing is, what is the impact on affordability if large investors are barred from purchasing more single-family homes, which President Trump said he's taking steps to do this?
Yes, I don't think if the Fed stops, no one in the market is expecting the Fed to start a massive MBS buying program or loan buying program to drive rates lower. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's in the cards. I don't think anybody expects it. So if the Fed buys $200 billion of MBS and then doesn't buy any more, I don't think it's going to make a lot of difference in the overall interest rates and the 30-year mortgage. That will go up and down with what rates are doing in general. If the federal authorities ban, as you say, investment in houses by corporations, then yes, that will free up, it will take some of the pressure from the housing market. Because after all, why is a large corporation or a private equity company buying homes? Well, they're buying it because they expect prices to go up. They're not going to live in the homes. So if that is limited, yes, it will leave more homes available for the retail buyer and take some pressure from prices. Because if you look at the median home price, it's almost 50% in the past, I think, since COVID. That is a very high increase and makes it difficult for retail buyers, especially new buyers, first-time buyers, to get into the housing market.
Okay, Joseph, it's always good to speak with you. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me on. Have a good afternoon.
You as well. General Motors says it will take a $6 billion charge as it scales back parts of its electric vehicle strategy. The car maker cites weaker demand and changes in federal policy. GM said the charge reflects a reassessment of EV production plans in North America as consumer interest cooled and government incentives declined. Around $2 billion of the charge is tied to non-cash write-downs. The remaining $4 billion covers supplier settlements and canceled investments. GM said it became the second largest EV seller in North America in late 2024, but demand slowed in 2025 after tax credits were eliminated and emissions rules eased. President Trump is having a meeting at the White House with oil and gas executives now. Let's take a look.
At very rapid speeds and helicopters, and to come out with no deaths and the loss of no equipment. It was pretty amazing. Nobody's seen anything like it. I was called by the leaders of numerous countries. I won't go into which ones, but the biggest and the strongest, and they said that was very impressive. They're all impressed. But today I'm delighted to welcome almost 24 of the biggest and most respected oil and gas executives in the world to the White House. It's an honor to be with them. We have many others that were not able to get in. I said if we had a ballroom, we'd have over 1,000 people. Everybody wanted. I never knew your industry was that big. I never knew you had that many people in your industry. But here we are. And if you, in fact, if you look, come to think of it, well, I got to look at this myself. Wow. What a view. This is the door to the ballroom. What did you... Unusual time to look, but I figure we might as well do it. If the fake news would like to go back and take a look, you can, but you'll see a very big foundation that's moving. We're ahead of schedule in the ballroom and under budget. It's going to be, I don't think there'll be anything like it in the world, actually. I think it'll be the best. We went from, this is, as you know, our biggest room, which would seat 100 for dinner, maybe, if you're lucky, if you're nice and tight. And the ballroom will seat many. And it'll also take care of the inauguration with bulletproof glass, drone-proof ceilings, and everything else, unfortunately, that today you need. So we're going to discuss how these great American companies can help rapidly rebuild Venezuela's dilapidated oil industry and bring millions of barrels of oil production to benefit the United States, the people of Venezuela, and the entire world. And yesterday, the number is 30 million barrels. I can't even, is that a correct number? 30 million barrels. You hear that, Peter? Of oil was given to us by Venezuela. That's a lot of oil. It's about $4 billion worth, and it's on its way to the United States right now. And we want to thank Venezuela for that. And we're working very well with them, obviously, or they wouldn't have been so generous. But they respect us again. They didn't respect us at all before. So that's money that goes to the United States. Some will go to Venezuela, and some will go to the oil companies, but not that, because that's already been extracted. So when you're not getting any of that, but when you start extracting, you'll get. But it's tremendous reserves, among the biggest in the world. Some people say it is the biggest in the world. And we're going to be working with Venezuela. We're going to be making the decision as to which oil companies are going to go in, that we're going to allow to go in. Going to cut a deal with the companies. We'll probably do that today or very shortly thereafter with Chris and Doug. And we're dealing with the country, so we're empowered to make that deal. And you'll have total safety, total security. One of the reasons you couldn't go in is you had no guarantees, you had no security, but now you have total security. It's a whole different Venezuela, and Venezuela is going to be very successful. And the people of the United States are going to be big beneficiaries because we're going to be extracting, numbers of, in terms of oil, like, few people have ever seen, actually. So You're dealing with us directly. You're not dealing with Venezuela at all. We don't want you to deal with Venezuela. Let me thank Vice President J.D. Vance, who's doing a fantastic job. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, likewise, a fantastic job. I have good people. I like them better than my first group. But we had a great, despite that, we had a great first term. We had some great people there, too, by the way. But we had a great first term. We had the greatest economy in the history of our country in the first term, but this is blowing it away. And you haven't seen anything yet. Everyone's been shocked by the numbers, 5.4% GDP. And that's despite the fact that we were badly hurt by the Democrat shutdown, of which they'd like to see if they could shut it down again. Secretary of the Interior, Doug Burgum, who's fantastic. Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, recommended by Doug as being the greatest oil man anywhere in the world, because I wanted Doug for that job, energy, and Doug said, no, sir, there's a man named Chris Wright. I said, who the hell is Chris Wright? He said he's the most talented oil man anywhere in the world. I doubt you can get him, because typically oil men make a lot of money, and women. They make a lot of money, but Chris came. You took one of the greatest salary cuts probably in history, Chris, right? But he's a fantastic person, loves our country, and many other important members of this team. And I want to thank them for their efforts. As you know, last week, the United States Armed Forces performed one of the most spectacular military operations in American history, apprehending the outlaw dictator Nicolas Maduro for his crimes against the United States, crimes for which he has now been indicted and is in federal court awaiting trial. And he killed many people, millions of people, actually, and allowed jails, prisons, mental institutions, insane asylums, drug dealers, drug addicts to pour into our country totally unchecked because of Sleepy Joe Biden's policy of open borders, the stupidest thing I've ever seen. We're getting them all out. The departure of Maduro makes it possible an incredible future for both nations, Venezuela and the United States, in which we will more closely integrate the economies of two major energy powers in the Western Hemisphere. Energy coming out of Venezuela was very small. One of the things the United States gets out of this will be even lower energy prices. We have people now getting gasoline for $1.99, $1.96, $1.95, $1.92 yesterday, somebody. And it used to be $3.50, $4, $5 a gallon. Think of that, $1.99. Decades ago, the United States built Venezuela's oil industry at tremendous expense with American skill, technology, know-how, and dollars. But those assets were stolen from us, and we had presidents who did nothing about it. This president is much different than your other presidents. They did nothing about it. They stole it. Some of the people in this room were a little bit younger when that happened, but not that much younger. It wasn't that long ago. But they stole our assets like we were babies, and the United States did absolutely nothing about it. So now we're doing everything about it. Now we're doing 500% about it, but it's a long time after the act took place. So they stole from us, and it was taken by socialists and communists at the time, and Venezuela was going bad, really bad. And as much oil as they have, they're producing almost nothing, which is just a system. So we're really, if you look at it, we're taking back what was taken from us. They took our oil industry. We built that entire oil industry. Started a long time ago, but they took it, and they were very ungracious to this country, but now they're being very nice. American companies will have the opportunity to rebuild Venezuela's rotting energy infrastructure and eventually increase oil production to levels never, ever seen before. When you add Venezuela and the United States together, we have 55% of the oil in the world. The United States is number one. We have them drilling. Drill, baby, drill was my campaign, and Doug and Chris, I think we're setting records on drilling right now and taking oil without Venezuela. That's how we're getting the oil prices down. The plan is for them to spend, meaning our giant oil companies will be spending at least $100 billion of their money, not the government's money. They don't need government money. But they need government protection and need government security that when they spend all this money, it's going to be there so they get their money back and make a very nice return. The plan is for them to spend at least $100 billion to rebuild the capacity and the infrastructure necessary. Venezuela has also agreed that the United States will immediately begin refining and selling up to 50 million barrels of Venezuelan crude oil, which will continue indefinitely. We're all set to do it. We have the refining capacity. It was actually based very much on the Venezuelan oil, which is a heavy oil, very good oil, great oil. It's fantastic for certain things like asphalt roads, the best there is in the world for asphalt roads and other things. All of the companies here today are going to be treasured partners in bringing the nation of Venezuela back to life, restoring its economy, and generating great wealth for their companies and for their people, and also great wealth for the American people, and tremendous wealth for the companies that are going in. The companies that are going in, and if you don't want to go in, just let me know, because I got 25 people that aren't here today that are willing to take your place. So I just want to thank, these are people that I either know or I know of by reading lots of business magazines and journals and papers. These are the greatest oil people anywhere in the world. Harold Hamm, I see, is here. Harold, you know, there's a story about Harold Hamm that he could look at a piece of land, put a straw into the land, and oil pours out. Is that true about you? Whereas some of you guys have to invest hundreds of millions of dollars to find that oil. So we can't let that story be true. But they say Harold puts a straw into the land and oil comes gushing out. So you're not a big R&D person, are you, huh? He's called Instinct for Oil. Now, he's got other problems, but we won't talk about those problems. But he's been a great supporter of mine for a long time, haven't you, Harold? So congratulations. But we have, and I think Harold would agree, we have the greatest oil men and women anywhere in the world sitting in this room right now. And we have a lot of people that will be back to see us sometime next week. We're going to have another meeting for another group. But we're going to do this very quickly. We can have this done almost immediately. So I'd like to thank you all for being here. I'd like to invite Vice President Vance to say a few words, followed by Secretaries Rubio, Burgum, and Wright. And then we'll have a few words from representatives that are here and to discuss their ideas, a couple of them. We have Chevron, which has been, where's Chevron? Where are you?
Far right.
No, I thought you'd have a better location. You were the only one that was there for all that. I used to call you and say, what the hell is going on with Venezuela? He stuck it out. I don't know if you made money or not, but you stuck it out. I got to give you a lot of credit for that. Mark Nelson, thank you very much. Exxon CEO Darren Woods. Darren, thank you very much. How's Exxon doing? Okay? They'll do a lot better now, won't they, huh? Exxon's been amazing. It's been an amazing company. And ConocoPhillips CEO Ryan Lance, thank you very much. So you guys could say something, and then we'll take some questions from the press. And if anybody else would like to speak, we'll have you speak. We have all the time in the world. This is a big subject. This is massive wealth. And more importantly than massive wealth, it leads to lower taxes and a lot of jobs for Americans and for Venezuelans, but for Americans in this case. And I just, again, appreciate you all being here.